the presentation I'm going to do is based and basically provide with a bit of a summary of some key ideas that I've been developing for sometimes now and that appear in a formal way in this paper. The link to this paper, which is open access, you can find in the chat, as well as the presentation, the PowerPoint itself. It's at the top of the chat. There are two links. So that if you're interested, you can download both the PowerPoint and the paper. So in order to introduce a bit, usually in science, we put the bibliography at the end. Here, I'm going to start with it, not to show off, but more to illustrate the fact that the reflection I would like to share with you is in a way the product of a reflection that has been inscribed in time, that is inscribed in a process itself. And so this paper that I'm referring to itself came after a fair amount of other writings, including a book I published a few years ago, where you may find some parts of and some ideas that I'm trying now to reorganize and put all together. And so it started from 15 years ago with my interest for complexity theories and critique in education, and more recently my interest for the temporalities and the rhythms of emancipatory processes and transformational processes in adult education. So in a way, the reflection that I'm sharing with you today is inscribed in this legacy, in a way of thinking, and try to connect some of the dots. So I'd like to start maybe very practically. I mean, when I wrote this paper last year, I had in mind obviously the pandemic. That was the context within which this reflection emerged. And I would like to invite you to think about the experience we've been through for those two past years, and see how do we envision the marks, the influence that it's going to have on our lives on the long run. In my practice in higher education, I'm working using life histories and biographical approaches, which means that I'm mainly working with narratives that are written by adult learners who try to describe events in their life in order to make sense and give meaning to the process of development they've been through throughout their life. And so we could ask ourselves, in 10 years from now, if we had to think about the influence and the impact of the pandemic, how would we relate to it? How would we describe it? And my bet would be that in a few years from now, we'll refer to the pandemic as an event, as an episode that has punctuated, in a way, people's life individually and collectively, had probably a significant impact on most people's life. And so it may be remembered as a turning point, whether it's because people who have had the opportunity to change professionally something significant in their life, maybe quitting their job, or whether it's brought them to meet people or confront themselves to new relationship, or leave relationship, or divorce, because we also know this crisis has an impact obviously on family life for many people. So the impact of this crisis may be remembered as a turning point, as an event that eventually brought a drastic change in one's life. But at the same time, as we are barely getting out of this crisis, and we are not even sure yet whether we are really going to get out of it at this time, we still experience it as a process, as something that unfolded through a pretty significant duration. And so the question for me is, how are we going to keep track? How are we going to keep memories of this process, knowing the fact that, I don't know for you, but I could say for myself, 2 years later, I already forgot a lot of the dilemmas, tension, questions I had 2 years ago. For example, with the first confinement that we experienced, in this case specifically in Switzerland, where I'm currently living. So what are we going to remember from all those dynamics that unfolded during a pretty long duration, including the struggles that we have been experiencing. And I'm going to refer to that today in this presentation. The question also is, what are we going to forget? And in my work, I refer, and I've tried to develop this idea of rhythmic unconscious to refer specifically to those dynamics that we've been experiencing that are part of a process of development, but that eventually don't leave some form of mark and therefore may be forgotten at some point. And I think from a critical perspective, what's crucial here is also to question ourselves about what we would like to remember from a process such as the one we have been through that otherwise may be forgotten. And what I would like to argue today with you is that there may be educational value to question the process we are going through when we experience some kind of critical events, rather than reducing the complexity of this experience to just a series of punctual events or just a compression of such a crisis to an event or in itself. So maybe to go a bit further in the reflection, it may be relevant to use a metaphor. And that's the metaphor that I've been starting with in this article, the metaphor of the whirlpools of a river. And I'm just going to briefly read this extract. As the river carves its bed, the experience of a crisis leaves deep traces. If retrospectively the erosion caused by the continuous flow of water demonstrates the transforming power of a river, it does not, however, reveal the whirlpools that agitate it. It may be the same with the experience of a crisis. The resulting traces give an account of the significant changes in which it participates, whereas the everyday learning experiences that contribute to it tend to fade in the memories that we can keep of it. However, the recognition of these whirlpools of experience also carries significant learning opportunities. These swirls refer to our everyday experiences of change. They manifest the intrapsychic, interpersonal, and social dynamics that form and transforms individuals and collectives day after day. More fundamentally, the study of these whirlpools may open up possibilities to interpret the ways in which forms of influence, power, and constraint unfold, both in crisis situations and in normal times on a daily basis and over the long term. For me, what's critical here is really to advocate for the fact that there is, I think, some form of political value into the interpretation of critical events as processes rather than just events, because I strongly believe that once we get to the point where there is the turning point that emerge in such situations, it's often too late to have some influence on what's going on. And so the fact to inscribe the crisis within a duration and consider it as a process may open up ways to maintain under tensions what is at stake in the whatever conflict or antagonism are part of the crisis. And so that's a bit the next point I would like to make here. The idea that when we think about a crisis, there are really two different points of view that are complementary, by the way, that we can adopt. And one is to consider the crisis as an event. From that point of view, the crisis tends to be confused with the incident that triggered it, which is considered to be brutal, punctual, surprising, unpredictable, and improbable. It is characterized by the rapidity of its development, the compression of the time for decision-making, and the confusion of the circumstances associated with it. An event-based approach to crisis therefore tends to favor a study of the fact considered a posteriori, favoring a reactive posture rather than an approach based on anticipation and prevention. On the other hand, if we consider crisis as a process, it is then envisioned through a progression in its intensity and visibility, allowing for different stages. For example, precursory signs, triggering events, amplification, resolution, and so on. It should be conceived as the product of cumulative and potentially detectable dysfunctions or tensions, the dynamics of which may suddenly appear out of control. So the crisis unfolds within systems whose large number of interacting elements and their interrelationship contribute to making its emergence inevitable, even if it remains unlikely and unpredictable. A processual approach leads to focus our attention prior to the triggering event on the conditions that favored its emergence, while at the same time questioning the dynamics that allow it to unfold. So in my opinion, considering crisis from a processual perspective may potentially be empowering because it keeps open up the possibilities to think about the tensions that feed the crisis, rather than consider it as an event that has been just emerged and happened, and toward which it's too late in a way to react once it has happened. So from a processual perspective, I think, and from also an educational perspective, the idea is that considering critical events should promote or should bring us to reflect on what feeds or what fed the emergence or the potential emergence of crisis. For example, if I connect here with a theory that probably some of you know, Jacques Meziero's theory on transformative learning theory, in the contribution of Jacques Meziero, transformation occur in adult life, usually starting from what Meziero called disorienting dilemmas. And what's interesting in Meziero's theory is that for him, transformations are processes, but it tends to reduce the point of departure of that process to an event that he associates with a disorienting dilemma. And so from my point of view, I think it's important to see the experience of dilemmas that may eventually trigger transformative processes, to see those experiences of dilemma as themselves being inscribed in processes and not just events in time. Because then we can try to reflect on where they come from and how have they been regulated or managed. And that's what I'm going to also refer to a bit later. So maybe another point that's important to mention at this point, and I forgot to mention that earlier, but most of my contribution here is informed by a very significant paper from Edgar Morin, the French philosopher and sociologist, who in 1976 edited a special issue of a journal called Communication, with some big names in a way from different academic disciplines to bring them to reflect on this concept of crisis. And Morin's point was really to try to develop a theory, a general theory of crisis. And so my contribution today is really built on this initial contribution from Morin. And so as very rightly Morin does point the fact that the experience of a crisis can always lead to different outcomes, and two significant outcomes, either regression or progression, and sometimes both at the same time, depending on what we are considering as a phenomena. So on one hand, a crisis involves a potential for regression, which is characterized by the loss of complexity and flexibility of the system. The richest qualities and the freedoms acquired disappear, while the most primitive or rigid structures are consolidated. And if I take the example of the pandemic, obviously one way to consider the regression, there's many ways regressions have been observed, but from a psychological perspective, for example, we can see the defense mechanism implemented by peoples in order to deal with the anxiety and the tension and the uncertainty experienced as triggering mechanism, psychological mechanisms that tend to limit the understanding of the complexity of the situation. And we could see the emergence of theory of, now the word is missing, théorie du complot in French. In English, the words now doesn't come to me. Conspiracy theory as a response for some people, as defense mechanism for some people to try to make sense of a situation that is otherwise too difficult to grasp. On the other hand, a crisis can also lead to progress that manifest themselves through the acquisition of new qualities or properties that contribute to the complexification of the system. And from this point of view, the experience of crisis mobilizes processes of reconfiguration that lead to more or less profound disorganizations and reorganizations that participate in a transformative or even evolutionary process. And so from an educational perspective, that's obviously the outcome that we are trying to look at, how crisis can be reintegrated, how can we give meaning to the experience of crisis in order to experience a progression and an enrichment in a way of people's experience. But I think it's important here to stress the fact that within the experience of crisis, we never know obviously what's going to emerge. That's actually what defines a crisis, is the uncertainty about what's going to emerge from it. And therefore, that's part of what constitutes the fluidity of a situation of crisis. And that's one of the points I'm going to stress now with you. So before to move toward the theme of fluidity, I'd like to say a few more words about how we can connect the experience of crisis with learning theories. And I'm not going to develop here these slides in detail because I assume that you may already be familiar with some of those contributions. But I appreciate the fact that we can roughly simplify in a way the experience of learning by distinguishing different levels. And I'm following here authors such as Gregory Bateson or Jack Medzeros or Chris Argyris and Donald Chun to refer to those three levels or three layers in a way of learning. And the first level, which is the most superficial, the most instrumental, refer to the kind of experience that we may have in the everyday life in a way. Behavioral changes that occur progressively that contribute to modify routines or way of functioning within a set system, and according to the experience or the problem that we have to solve. And so, for example, with the pandemic in the first period, we had to learn very basic things such as using masks, in which setting they appear as useful, and trying to appropriate for ourselves new habits, sanitary habits, for instance, in order to cope with the risk of contamination. Now, there is a second level, and Bateson called it second order learning. Medziro referred to communication learning. We can also refer to double loop learning that refer to changes of frames of reference in the way we interpret the meaning of what's happening. And so from that point of view, learning occurs as it relates to how we change interpretations in order to make sense and give meaning to what's occurring. And for example, for me, a significant example during the pandemic was the succession of the waves of contamination. I mean, we've been up to, I think, 5 or 6 waves of contamination. And but for example, I remember very significantly the first waves, I mean, for me, brought insight about how unprepared I felt I was, but also collectively the society within which I'm living. And so there was some kind of insight about, what does it mean to be prepared when we are facing such kind of challenges? And then with the succession of waves of contamination, the insight and the evolution of the way we give meaning to the crisis evolved. Up to a point where there was some kind of fatigue going on, wondering, if it was still worth making the effort of trying to face the pandemics or find alternative way of behaving. So questioning that were more in depth, but still remain about the meaning given to this situation. And finally, there is this third level, whether we call it third order learning or emancipatory learning or triple loop learning, that refer to a more in-depth inquiry that is actively, and that's a very important point here, that is actively engaged by people in order to question the frames of reference and the paradigm that eventually limit the actions undertaken or the way of thinking or feeling about them. So at this level, the effect of a crisis have repercussion on identity or institutions and on the way we define the meaning of one's own existence. And so often, especially in the literature on transformative learning theory, we tend to assume that the experience of a crisis will trigger that third level of learning, those kind of transformative learning or emancipatory learning. But I think it's important here to stress the fact that such kind of learning are highly are very difficult to anticipate. And I think we can go through major crises such as a pandemic and not necessarily experiencing transformative learning. So I think here this distinction is useful because it allows us to think about how to nuance a bit the kind of learning that we may experience when we are facing crises. So the main point I would like to make in this presentation is really here. It's really about the fact that whether we consider whatever level of learning we are considering, whether it's instrumental, communicational, or emancipatory, one key aspect of the experience of a crisis is the fact that it confronts us to the fluidity of the events we are facing. So the experience of a crisis is characterized by a progression of disorders, instabilities, contingencies that increase uncertainties and makes its effect unpredictable. It highlights the uncertainties, ambivalences, ambiguities, but also the tensions and the conflicts which in a complementary and contradictory way stimulate and hinder the learning processes experienced. So those tension, this uncertainty, those that we're experiencing in time of crisis, both may stimulate learning and eventually lead to some form of progress, at the same time as they may hinder learning because they may be source of confusion, source of anxiety, of tension that prevent people to process their experience and the meaning giving to it. So the experience of a crisis reveals a fluidity that can be found at all levels of learnings. So again, to go back to the distinction I was making between those three levels of learning, in the everyday life, this fluidity emerged very early in the experience of the pandemic because we were facing all the possible behaviors that we had to adopt in order to manage the risk of contamination. And in the first few months, or even the first year of the pandemic, there was a lot of uncertainty about the nature of the virus, the way it was transmitted, and so on. So even those everyday behavior were not clear about which one to adopt. Now, in a more kind of, at another level, for example, I have two young children. In our case, some of the questioning we had was whether we could trust, the information that were communicated by schools and the authorities, and the way the understanding of the pandemics was developed in some institutions and how that was eventually contradicting other sources of information in newspaper and so on, and so, or in scientific contribution. And so there was this kind of lability, of fluidity of meanings around the risk associated with the crisis that we had to learn to manage also. But this fluidity was also, so the fluidity was about the behaviors, the fluidity was about the meanings associated also with this situation. And for many people, it get crystallized around the tension between, for example, family life and professional life, as people were constrained to work from home. And so again, it triggered the need to renegotiate the balance between work and family life, for example, when people were confined in the same space. And therefore may trigger also learning opportunities about how we give meaning and how we balance those different spheres of one's existence. And so at a third level, there is obviously all the tension between and the questions associated with the different ways to manage the crisis at a meta level. For many, the pandemic was an opportunity to eventually challenge the system within which we are living. And by that, I mean capitalist society, liberal way of understanding economical exchanges, and so on. For others, it was about linking with the environmental crisis, hoping that some of the changes that may occur could eventually serve another purpose. So we can see that even at this level, there was a fluidity, and there is still a fluidity about what can remain as an effect of the crisis. Whether it really changed people's way of relating to their environment remain to be seen, but there is clearly some form of fluidity there and opportunities for change. So the crisis reveals those fluctuations and oscillations as they characterize the dynamics of transformation. So if we admit the idea that a crisis reveals fluidity of changes that we're experiencing in the everyday life, then the question, including from an educational point of view, is how can we think about this fluidity? How can we conceive it in a way that we can use from an educational perspective? Because this fluidity is neither a full chaos of disorder, and nor is it just an ordered structure of or organized, well-organized way of behaving or way of thinking. So it's really between order and disorder that we have to understand such phenomena. So what I'm suggesting here, and let me just check the time, I have a little more time, so I'm good to go. I would like to suggest three paths in a way to think about this fluidity, because I think that's also there, that's a possibility to envision learning opportunities when we are thinking about situations of crisis. So here I'm building up on Morin's contribution, and Morin suggested to develop his theory of crisis inspired by systemic theory, cybernetic theory, and theory of organization, and what he called the negentropic principle. Without going into the detail of his own contribution, that's what helped me structure a bit what I'm going to present you now. So the first way we can think about the fluidity that is revealed in a situation of crisis is by paying attention to the patterns that organize this fluidity, and more specifically the fluidity of learning over time. So for Morin, and what we can see in any situation of crisis, is that a crisis reveals tensions, antagonism, and those antagonism and tensions are constitutive of the system that we are considering, whether it's a person, whether it's an institution or a collectivities. And so the crisis does not create necessarily new antagonism. The crisis reveals antagonism that were already there. And so what we see in a situation of crisis is that there may be tensions, contradictions, ambivalence between states, behaviors, belief, feelings or posture that we can have. And therefore, the fluidity of the experience is in a way organized around dualities or tensions that are part of who we are and part of the institution we are living in. It has been said about the pandemics reveal economical inequalities. It reveals gender inequalities. It reveals inequalities between different professions and so on. So, or between different areas in the world and so on. So those inequalities, those tensions, those antagonisms existed before, but they are revealed, they are actualized by the experience of the crisis. And so I think from a learning perspective, it's interesting to use that as a lens, because somewhere the crisis reveals things that we have in ourselves that are part of the system we are evolving through, but it makes it much more striking, much more obvious, and also much more open to be renegotiated. And that's why, for me, considering a crisis as a process is important, because it let open the possibilities to renegotiate the way we experience such tensions. So to be very concrete here, those antagonisms that are revealed by crisis can really take any kind of form. I mean, I've mentioned here in this slide embodied experiences. For example, at some point, there was this tension between being immobile, not being able to move out of one's house or one's country, versus the experience of mobility. So that tension revealed also a lot of insight, I think, about the way we relate to the space we are living in. There is obviously the tension between healthy and unhealthy, how we define those features, between conflicting psychological states or dispositions, between obviously ideological values or differentiated social status. For example, the crisis has not been experienced the same way for people who were living single or who were in a relation, who were in family or not, and so on. So being autonomous or being dependent, depending on your age, being employed or unemployed. So all those tensions were revealed once again, in a way, by the crisis. So the fluctuation that comes with the alternation between different states may be critical to explore and question. It opens up the possibility to envision the fluidity of the life course through the recurring dialogical tensions that are constitutive of the fabric of one's own existence. What am I trying to say here? Is that, in a way, those tensions, those antagonisms that pre-existed the experience of crisis, they're also shaping who we are and how we develop ourselves. Even if the pandemic stops, some of those tensions will still be in our life. And so, but we may no longer have either the possibility or the desire or the need to face their influence on our life. So that's why I see the crisis as an opportunity, because it reveals those tensions and those antagonisms, and therefore trigger possibilities to question the way we give meaning to them, but also from a more kind of dialogical perspective, how they are integrated in our lives. And so that's one first layer of interpretation. The second one, once we have acknowledged the presence of those antagonisms, those tensions within ourselves and within the collectivities and the institution we are living through, the next point, the next question is, how do we regulate those tensions? Usually when there is a crisis emerging, there is some form of dysfunction in the way those antagonisms are regulated. Well, obviously with a pandemic, it's about the regulation of how we manage foreign biological entities and how they contaminate us. And once this is under control, we may eventually consider that the crisis is no longer existing. That's partly what emerged with the creation of the vaccine in the case of the pandemic. So what is at stake here is how do we regulate those tensions? And more specifically, how do we learn to regulate those processes that are constitutive of the crisis? So with the example of the pandemic, what we could say here is that in a way, if we look at the succession of the different waves of contamination, they have been in a way illustrating the capacity, the collective capacity to cope with the biological risk of the virus. And it came through the repetition of different strategies implemented. So what I'd like to point here is the fact that when we are facing a crisis, although we tend to reduce crisis to an event, it is actually constituted by the repetition of situations that we are facing in the everyday life, and that include processes that are repetitive. And therefore, it's interesting to read a situation of crisis through the repetition and the periodicities in a way that are constitutive of it. So it can be in the everyday life, or it can be through the on a longer period.
5 minutes, Michel?
Yes, thank you, Fadia. So studying the phenomena of repetition associated with a crisis leads to question how the crisis relates to previous and future learning experiences, and more specifically to existing modalities of regulation that may be reenacted to cope with it. So typically, defense mechanisms that we may implement to face psychologically to the tension of a crisis take their roots in psychological experience that we have built up throughout one's life. So understanding those filiation helps understanding also what is repeated eventually in a situation of crisis. And it's true also collectively. So it brings us to pay attention to the modalities of regulation themselves and the way they influence the possibilities to learn from them. And finally, the third entry point that we can have, which in a way is the most obvious when we think about crisis, it's the threshold. I mean, Fadia, you were mentioning liminality as a theme in this seminar. When we think about crisis, obviously we refer also to those thresholds that are passed at some point with some form of irreversible effect. I think it's important from a processual perspective to conceive those thresholds as emergence. They don't come out of nowhere. They are produced by effect of accumulation. And so I think it's important to see the reproduction of experiences, those repetitive experiences that we have throughout a critical process, as having cumulative effect that built up. And so they may contribute to threaten, for example, the integrity of the system due to the depletion of resources, the radicalization of implemented measures, or the rigidity, as well as they can eventually bring to the emergence of new properties, contributing to the renewal of the situation by accelerating awareness or the diffusion of information or exchanges and collaborations. The fact that we've been able to produce vaccine in such a short amount of time for me is a major threshold, or illustrate a major threshold in the way science can be productive and positively productive, I think. So these phenomena participate in the reorganization of way of thinking, feeling, acting, or collaborating, both at the individual and collective level. And as the crisis unfolds, these reconfigurations become conscious through those liminal moments that may be interpreted as thresholds and that determine how people experience the irreversibility of the changes taking place. So from that point of view, and that's the last thing I'll say here, paying attention to the experiences of saturation or reconfiguration raises question about the way people and collectives learn to perceive and interpret, obviously, major disruptions, but also incremental changes whose manifestations are not obvious in normal times, including those weak signals that we may eventually capture in the everyday life, although they may not be that obvious. And I think there is also something to think about here about how we can learn to develop some form of intelligence in the way we refer to those experiences that are constitutive of critical processes. And that's where I would like to finish the presentation. I think it opens up what I've tried to communicate shortly with you today, opens up the possibility to question the kind of learning that we may want to develop in order to cope with crises as processes and as rhythmic processes, because those are processes that unfold through time, displaying patterns, periodicities, and movement, including discontinuities, which are features of rhythmic phenomena. And so one of the hypotheses I'm working on right now is this idea of rhythmic intelligence as a capacity, individual and collective, to understand and represent the rhythmic dimensions that are inherent in any organized, observed, or experienced phenomenon. And that refer to that capacity also to establish and explore the relations that characterize the dynamics, the processes through which phenomena such as crises unfold through time in order to influence them in a deliberate, strategic, and critical manner, which suggests also some form of resonance in the way we relate to those experiences individually and collectively. I'm going to stop here so that we have enough time for the conversation. I will just mention briefly that I would love to keep in touch with those of you who would like to continue sharing reflection and questions around those themes. So I've put also in the PowerPoint that you can download a few links if you're interested in getting to more resources or pursuing the dialogue.